Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Futures Frame TV. I'm your host, Elise Crozer, on the Inequalities channel at Traces.Dreams. Today, I'm here with Elisabeth Schimpfössl. Elisabeth is a sociologist and Russianist, and she works on elite studies, researching the elite in Russia. Elisabeth is, like myself as well, a member of the Feminist International Network for Elite Research, and we are looking forward to hearing all about crazily rich Russians in a moment. Elisabeth, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Good to have you here. Elisabeth, you wrote a book recently that's called Rich Russians, that talks about, well, rich Russians. Can you say something about how you came into researching Russia and rich Russians?
That is two separate stories. So I started learning Russian. It was my first degree at university when I was 18, and that was quite random. I was thinking about learning Chinese, and then I was told that Chinese is 4 times more difficult than Russian. So I decided to go for the easy path. Plus, I combined it with history. I was always very interested in history, and Russian history is in no way boring. So that was quite an easy decision. And then I'm from Austria. In Austria, at the time, they introduced student fees for a very brief time, not actually much money, but then they withdrew them because it didn't make sense with the whole administration around it. And that was a time when I finished my first master's degree, started working, and felt like I can't possibly leave my university life behind. So I started doing another undergraduate, another master's degree, this time in sociology, and was very fascinated by all the studies, like, for example, by Bourdieu and many others, about how social structure, social inequality is being reproduced in a way we are not necessarily so aware about when we walk through life. And then I was thinking for a PhD, how could I combine my interest and my knowledge about Russia with my interest in studies of social reproduction and social inequality? And so it came that I tried to look at Russian society and use the Bourdieuian approaches that were usually only used on stable European societies and the US, and try to apply them onto Russia and see to what extent they were applicable.
Can you say something for those people that don't know Bourdieu's research in one sentence? His main part is the capital idea.
Apart from money, so the combination of how social resources, social networks, so social capital, cultural capital in form of education, in form of cultural knowledge, and a certain kind of art of walking through life and being able to assess art and culture, and how economic capital work together and help, in the case of Russia, this new upper class that was forming to establish, to cement itself, and eventually to reproduce itself. For Russia, of course, when I started, it was back in the mid-2000s. It was far too early to actually look at mechanisms of social reproduction. For that, you need to have already several generations in the being that you can look at what is happening from one generation to the next. So I adapted it to an approach where I wanted to look at what's the first generation of wealth that was still in a process of forming and finding its own identity, what they were doing, what strategy they were employing in order to try to pass on their status to their offspring. So now that's 15 years nearly later, and we still only see this process about to be happening. So we have the first oligarchs coming to an age where they need to think about what will happen next, what will they do with their fortunes, their big assets, and what role will their offspring, their children, play in this whole process. We are still not there that we could say that this first generational transfer has happened. It's about to happen, and ideas or kind of visions about it, and also practical preparations are just about to be taken on by rich Russians, and they're trying to figure out the path for their own families in this setting, which is quite interesting in Russia because we are now in a situation where we have the first generation of new wealth, and they came to wealth at a very similar period of time. So it was starting in the 1990s, then they were added by another layer in the 2000s during the oil boom. So we've got this kind of a compact generation of people in their 50s and 60s who are slowly about to pass on their wealth. And that will also happen at pretty much a very, very compact, short period of time. And that will be quite an interesting process to observe. My book, however, was about this first generation and how they see themselves, how they see their role in the world, how they think of themselves as deserving of who they are, what they think of why it was exactly them who got rich and not their classmates or university peers and so on.
Why do they think that it was them?
There is a very widespread conviction that they are just the best, and that their wealth is very much merit-based. So a combination of themselves thinking that they are the most intelligent, the most innovative. They're the ones who've got the necessary entrepreneurial spirits and ideas, but they're also those who put in the required hard work, discipline, effort, perseverance, and everything to make things work. Especially in the first period, you had people in the late 1980s, someone like the oligarch Khodorkovsky, who was then jailed for 10 years in a Siberian labor camp, who said every man who is not an oligarch is an idiot because everybody could have made it because we have all the same chances. So they're pretty convinced of their own superiority over the rest of society and of their own skills. What we don't have in Russia, in contrast to other societies, like, for example, in the US, where you have Warren Buffett who says about himself in a kind of half self-ironic mode that he was just being lucky, that actually his sisters would have been just as intelligent as he is, just as good as he is. He is someone who says he was lucky because at that time it was important to be male and to be at a certain age at the right moment. Russians hardly ever refer to luck. And there's also logic in it because getting rich in the 1990s and the 2000s was so closely connected to luck. And luck has been now really equally distributed in society that luck in itself is something considered illegitimate. So that's one thing that's almost completely absent in the Russian context. What they all, in fact, do have together, or almost all of them, we often think of Russia as rich as oligarchs who came from nowhere, rags to riches. And they've also, for some time, played with this image quite a bit, but it's something that's not actually holding true, both among my interviewees, but also among people in many other studies. There's a large majority of people who were born into at least the Soviet technical intelligentsia. The Soviet intelligentsia was a term used for all kind of people in white-collar professional jobs with a certain academic background or focus, such as medics, engineers, people in science, academia, teachers, and so on. And that, of course, provided those people head starts in all kind of ways to different levels, depending on what kind of intelligentsia strata they belong to. But that was something that proved very important for those who made it in the end. You see, for example, there are many rich who, especially the kind of people who are just about billionaires, clusters in certain universities of people who in their groups kind of also inspired each other and did certain things that helped them get to their riches.
Yeah, that makes me very sad in a way, because I saw that one of the interviewees that you talk about in your book was born in the same year as my father was in St. Petersburg. And I'm thinking maybe I would be the daughter of a billionaire if it wasn't because they had left the Soviet Union at the time. How do you think this specific context, the historical context over the last 20, 30 years in Russia relates to this bourgeoisization that you talk about with the elite. So the history of going from an incredibly equal country on international terms or in international comparison to an outrageously unequal country in just about 10 years or maybe 20. Do you think that has something to do with this perception that people hold of themselves as being very special?
That's a very good question. Bourgeoisification, I haven't yet talked about it. So one of the findings of my research is that rich Russians have very quickly, within a very short period of time, managed to acquire a whole range of attributes, features, and characteristics that makes them much more smoothly fitting into a certain idea of a bourgeoisie as we know it in countries all over the world. So they very quickly realized, and that's also something that's in contradicting our widespread perception, they very quickly realized that their initially very ostentatious demonstration of wealth, they're showing off their consumerism, will not be durable in the long term. So if they want to be able to pass on their status to their offspring, they will have to find certain morals and values and ideas that are less ephemeral, longer lasting in their character. And they very quickly, in the mid 2000s, as was happening very quickly, started turning their back onto those who were indulging in ostentatious lifestyles, and almost demonstratively were trying to do the opposite and dissociating themselves from them, which also for many made sense. They were also very honest about it and said, well, in the 90s when we had money appearing, it was of course that we were like little children. All of a sudden we could buy whatever we wanted. We were in a toy shop and we bought everything and tried everything. But after a certain time, you get bored of it, and you also start searching for something that makes more sense, that has some kind of deeper sense in it. And what they did was kind of one mass phenomenon is that they started engaging in philanthropy. That can be both in charity activities, but what was almost more important for the new identities was engaging in art, collecting art, patronizing art and other cultural projects, which allowed them to have certain self-identity of being people of culture, people of sophistication and elaborate, refined taste. So that was very important in this process. And of course, in this process, they also started remembering their own intelligentsia backgrounds and focusing on it, and also trying to reviving this own background, which also makes sense because it allows them to have a certain anchoring in the past, and also allows them to present themselves not as random people coming from nowhere, but individuals with a certain story behind them that also legitimizes their current social status. So that very much plays together with this self-perception. It doesn't actually work so well with this almost social Darwinist, sometimes in some cases, idea of being biologically superior to others. So that has historically a slightly different reason, and namely in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a process that just before very important. So in the decades before, under Stalin, had forbidden genetic research for some time. And when it came back in a very crude form after the war. That was a phase when the eugenic elements and moments in this whole realm started to be criticized very sharply and questioned in many countries in the West. And the Soviet Union had missed this development, and also what was going on in the West in the 1960s was a rising feminist movement that very fundamentally questioned the idea of gender, social status, and so on as something given by nature, and looked at things from a completely new perspective. In the Soviet Union, they didn't have this movement. Feminist movement was very, very weak and never led to such wider questioning of all these kind of parts of life. At the same time, the Soviet intelligentsia, especially those who were slightly close to dissent, was very attracted by kind of a very rudimentary genetic science. and kind of swallowed up what they had missing of all these kind of basic elements, and were very attracted to ideas that were already outdated in the West, and basically soaked them up. So they were very much into all this kind of almost naturalizing and biologizing of every human activity, of human nature, of history, of gender, and everything around.
They were creating the new Soviet man, right? I mean, that was the...
They were creating the new Soviet man, which at the beginning was not, it was not a regressive project as such. It was slightly naive in the very early days, in the 1920s with the early Bolsheviks, but later on it got this naturalized, biologized touch to it. And what it had in the post-war period was, for example, absolute boosting of motherhood. And that's still till now very strong, that motherhood is something so essential for every human being that you can't be female and realizing yourself unless you've realized this major duty biology has prescribed to you, namely setting up a family, having children, raising children. So a whole range of ideas that were very strong. So this kind of individual superiority, this biological thinking, is also so easily expressed and articulated even in public, because there's never been a force in society questioning it so fundamentally as been in the West. It doesn't mean that in the West people who are rich don't think the same. There have been interesting studies that show exactly the same, but it's nevertheless something people would be more subtle and more careful talking about in this way. But also, just a side remark, but was also a very strong parallel at the time in the 1970s in particular, was a huge admiration for what was going on in Chile and Pinochet, General Pinochet, and all this kind of Milton Friedman, this kind of purist teachings of neoliberalism, and how it was then attempted to realize in the Chilean context. And that was something which became extremely popular among the Soviet intelligentsia, and then also taken on in the 1990s by the early reformers, also some of my interviewees who tried to emulate Chilean reform paths in the early post-Soviet context.
And so the wild, wild East.
No, on the contrary, they thought it as a civilizing project.
Okay, so a modernization of the country, or?
Yes, there is, for example, one oligarch, Piotr Arvan. He lives in London now. He's got maybe 4 million. He was part of post-Soviet politics right from the start. He also was minister in 1992 for a brief period of time. And he and people around him were absolutely convinced that, and they're still till now, that the Chilean path is A, something to copy, B, neoliberalism will automatically lead to a society from which everybody will benefit, which then also has the consequence, and he told me that it was back in 2017 here in London, that everything in the end, where capitalism works, where it starts flourishing, everything will fall in place. So you will also then have private capital investing in medicine and education, taking over through private philanthropy, all spheres of life, and will be much superior in organizing society in the end, and which will then will be to the benefits of society as a whole. And it's quite interesting, we often have the idea of the early reformers, because they're bringing democracy into Russia, the ideas of them being Democrats. Arvan himself said very clearly, and is very outspoken about it, that in some situations you need to take dictatorial measures in order to implement neoliberal reforms. And he advised Putin when he came to power in 2000 to do exactly that, and use dictatorial measures in order to continue the reform process and privatizations and so on, in order to achieve this form of neoliberal society.
So apparently he has taken that device, it seems, right? Putin. I mean, he's not all too democratic, maybe. But what is the role or the place for these oligarchs that made it in their crazy ride in the 90s and then still became even richer in the 2000s? Where are they today?
Well, they didn't see their own role decreasing as it did. When Putin came to power, he gained a lot of control very easily and quickly, partly thanks to the oil boom. And yes, you're right here. From their neoliberal reformers' perspective, they wouldn't have necessarily wanted him to deprive some of the oligarchs who owned the biggest media empires of their assets and send them into exile and take control of everything. But you're absolutely right. In other ways, we usually think of the 1990s in Russia as this kind of, which it also was, this brutal period of privatizations, liberalization of the market and everything, which led to huge suffering, especially in the early years. But in terms of neoliberal reforms, the 2000s in Russia were actually much bigger. So the biggest reforms in post-Soviet Russia were happening in the early 2000s. The massive assets changed from state into private hands. Even so, it's often people often complain that Putin led to a renationalization of the economy, which is only true for some elements of the oil industry and other key industries, which is something every country in the world is doing. So every country has a at least partly state-owned flagship oil company if they are oil rich. So that's not an unusual process. But yeah, you're right. He acted in many ways actually as the reformers wanted, but yet nevertheless they are not happy with it. So Armin, for example, says that he blames nepotism in the political elite for a lot of the flaws and problems in Russian society today.
Well, he might be partly right about that. I guess there is nepotism in many elite circles, including the Russian one. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned before about their legacies and this legitimizing their wealth for themselves, the merit they feel they own. How does that make them feel in terms of passing on their wealth to the next generation? You're saying they're about to change hands, well, the wealth is about to change hands from the first generation to the second. What will happen there? What is the complications there?
There are several complications. The first thing is, which I encountered in several interviews, that in order to legitimize themselves and also allow their children to achieve legitimacy, is that they have the idea, or at least they kind of put forward the idea, that they will not pass on their fortunes to their children, or they will pass on only very little of their fortunes to their children. Arvin, for example, is someone who is saying that others, especially billionaires who are very engaged in philanthropy, were saying it. There's one, Roman Avdeyev. He's quite a character. He owns a bank and is worth about $1 billion plus. And he's got 23 children, 4 of whom are his biological children. He adopted the rest. He says he treats them all the same, but in order to give the children a chance to prove themselves and realize themselves, he does not provide them with anything apart from a car, the best education, and accommodation. All the rest of his billion will go to charity. And that is one of the few cases where it's actually quite credible. In other cases, I've had information of oligarchs claiming they would not pass on their inheritance to their children. But that's quite a vague perception if they buy them a big estate for 100, 200 million pounds somewhere in Britain. That is also a form of inheritance. So kind of, I think we need to kind of take this with a pinch of salt. In general, there's a certain reluctance to set up family dynasties and pass on business matters to their own children, which has several reasons. On the one hand, a lot of the businesses people have today, they set up with maybe a business partner in this Wild West 1990s, and the whole documentation, the whole paperwork behind it is completely unclear. So it wouldn't even be that easy to pass on all those matters to someone else. So that's kind of a problematic precondition. But then there's also the problem that so many of them have come to the ridges using methods that are not necessarily, maybe they're not ashamed of them, but maybe not the methods they would articulate in front of their children. So if they wanted to make one of their sons responsible for their business matters, they would also have to pass on all these kind of secrets of their money making, which some are clearly reluctant to do. And they also know about how dirty the business world can be, and it's not necessarily something they want their children to be exposed to. So there are all kind of reasons that make them reluctant to kind of elaborate an idea of that their businesses should live on. And there's also kind of in contrast to business dynasties, family businesses in many Western countries, where the business itself is kind of the whole essence of their life, the whole passion and everything. And in the Russian case, it's rather that many people, when they grow older, especially towards the late 2000s, when they were trying to find a certain deeper sense in life, that they were, some of them, rather trying to withdraw themselves from business matters and, for example, devote as much time as they possibly can to their art collections and their art patronizing. So they don't necessarily mind. So also this kind of process of rediscovering their intelligentsia backgrounds, many of them are quite keen to actually do something else in the last part of their lives, and are not opposed if their children enter a similar path in their interests and professions, which of course is in the first place was true for their daughters. Had a certain irony when children were sent to study in the UK. Many of the sons had quite limited choices. They had to study business or law or something of that sort, whereas girls could choose from the whole range of disciplines on offer, because they were not seen as having any responsibilities ever anyway. But that is changing now a little. So it's also this kind of process of the idea of securing wealth assets, but not necessarily making their children take over their businesses.
Would you say that that's because they see it in a more instrumental way, their business life? It's not like a vocation. They're not businessmen as such. They're men of culture or intelligentsia or something, and they kind of do the business because that gives them money and the chance to, as you describe in your book, some of these oligarchs take up their musical playing and give concerts even, or write poems. And
yes, it's absolutely right. The business matters. Some were very outspoken about it. Doing business, they were saying, is something vulgar, something you do not actually want to be doing if you don't have to. One needs money in order to do all the other interesting things in life, but it's not the money making as such that is of interest. So there's also this kind of intelligentsia ideas that sneak in, that have this kind of work ethics that is based on very different things, and money is something actually quite vulgar and dirty. But it's also interesting that among the young generation, but also the older one, when I asked them how they perceive themselves, some of them said almost that they're more intelligentsia than anything else. And there was a young guy I interviewed here in London as well. His father was about the 300th richest person in the world at some point in the 1990s. And he grew up, this young boy, must have been born in the mid-80s or so. He grew up in a luxury suburb in Moscow, Rublyovka, where Putin lives, where many of the oligarchs have their Versailles-style palaces. And so in absolute luxury suburb. And I asked him where he sees himself in society. And he first diverted into analyzing British society. And he said, it's terrible in Britain. It's such a strict class society. And it's so rigid, and so difficult to move from the one to the other, and he can't relate to it the slightest bit. And then I asked him where he sees himself in this whole structure, and he said, well, he doesn't fit into anything in British society, but if he had to place him somewhere, then he would place himself into the Russian intelligentsia. And then he explained Russian intelligentsia has existed for 150 years. So Russia's always been divided into two different parts in societies. There's the small group of intelligentsia, and then the big masses, and the one doesn't have anything to do with the other. So the big masses are the dull, uneducated, rough peasants. And then you have this very cosmopolitan, or historically very cosmopolitan, very sophisticated, very eloquent, philosophically advanced intelligentsia. And he sees himself as part of that group in society, which I found quite fascinating given his upbringing and also his social environments in his new home place in London.
So there's a very strict connection between high education, acculturation, and money, on the other hand, in their minds.
That's something studies showed already years ago. Rushanovskaya carried out a big study in the early 2000s where it was very clear hardly any elite in the world is as educated as the Russian one in terms of formal education, in terms of how many of them have higher education, and even how many of them have a doctorate or even another higher step. So kind of what gives you a professorial step in education. So formally, they clearly are, but that's not the end of the story. You can get into education and gain education. And here we come back to Bourdieu. It's rather this kind of upbringing and intelligentsia backgrounds provided to people. So there's this kind of, if you take a cliche idea of, and that's very important for many, and some interviewees also told me, there was one, for example, his name is Sukhanov, he lives 10 minutes from here in London, and he said, well, we didn't have anything to distinguish ourselves in the Soviet Union, but what we had were books and libraries in our houses. And those libraries had to be very, people are very proud when they were very, very well sorted, when they had really good books, when they had a kind of a nice combination of things. And so if you were born into an intelligentsia background, you had this kind of knowledge, education, all these kind of spirits of arts and everything around you all the time. And then further this idea of on the weekends going to the conservatory and to listen to music, then come home, maybe have friends around. We would play on the piano and everybody would sing together, or you would have a philosophical discussion about something and so on. There was, for example, another oligarch, Mahmoud is his name. He bought the book chain Waterstones in 2011. He sold it again by now. And he told me after about half a minute, it was very important for him that I understood very clearly right away that he was born into an intelligentsia family. His father is still working at the time as a professor in law, some Western University. And he explained this kind of background he grew up in exactly those terms. So that's something that also, like Bourdieu, when he talks about cultural capital, this kind of sense of knowledge and education and erudition and literature and everything that gives you a head start and a certain confidence, and also is admired and respected by everybody. So this kind of inner knowledge you can only learn if you've been exposed to it from the very start of your life in a certain kind of way. And that is something they identify with very strongly.
Yeah, I smile because, I mean, I never had a piano in my house, but the philosophical discussions and the books and the importance of education is clearly something that I guess is more widespread in Russia, way beyond the elite or the oligarchic circles, and that probably travels with you even if you go all around the world. But there's one quote, I think Piotr said in your book, in one of the Rich Russians. He says that The high level I occupy implies not only access to luxury and comfort, but also the ability to correctly evaluate luxury and comfort. And that goes with this distinction that you mentioned, right? The sophistication that comes with it is way more important than the means to, of course you need the money because you need to be able to access these comfort means, but the actual importance is to be able to not only show them, but understand them yourself and, be sophisticated. Is that how you'd characterize them? Or?
Oh, totally. But we mustn't get a completely wrong impression. So Piotr, at the beginning, I came into his office, he looked very rough. And he asked me right at the start, will it be an anonymized interview or not? I said anonymized, because it was very clear he would have given me a completely different talk otherwise. But he also looked quite rough, because I felt, wow, he must have had quite a night out the night before. And it's clearly someone who has a very hedonistic lifestyle, who also fits all kind of categories of ostentatious lifestyle, if you want so, and also indulges in it almost with a certain kind of, with a great fashion, let's say. And also, for example, if you look at Mahmoud, when I started my research, he was very, very famous for his grandiose parties on one of his yachts in the south of France, which were very lavish and very grand. So it's, in order not to create a completely wrong impression, there are kind of different sides to them. And of course, there's also a historical process of, I can easily imagine that Mahmoud, at the time when he was setting up his book business and investing also in art projects, he set up an art and design school in the center of Moscow, that by the time he might have already been partying less and focusing more on art and culture related things. So of course they've also been changing over the years, so that's also important. But we shouldn't see them as these kind of purists in any way. So that's very important.
That would not be Russian to be purist.
There was, for example, this couple, Gennady and Larissa. He's a billionaire. He's also been around from the very start after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they live not in this luxury suburb on the Rublyovka, but demonstratively have their summer house in the north of Moscow, which is in a completely different style. So it's wooden houses. It reminded me a lot of what I know from Austria, where I grew up, is close to Switzerland, this kind of Eastern Swiss architecture, which is very modern in its features, and all wood-based. And so they looked like kind of oversized examples of what I know from Eastern Switzerland. And they were very proud of it. So nothing like the Versailles style palaces you see in the more traditional luxury suburb. And the wife, Larissa, she was very concerned. She kind of in a supercar was driving me from the house to a restaurant in this housing complex. And she was saying that modesty is something extremely important to her. And I was looking at her car and kind of on her manicure and everything. And she said, no, it doesn't mean that she's got a Spartanic lifestyle in any way. Modesty in a certain kind of character and your spiritual thinking and of how you relate to other people and so on, which I then read as also in kind of what people you have around you. So it's very important for them to have people from the world of arts and culture to mingle with, have a certain closeness to it. In her case, is also that she only reads Russian classics. She read one time a modern writer, Pelevin, but usually she reads all the classics time and again. So a certain kind of a self-fashioning in a certain kind of self-created modesty in their lifestyle, which doesn't mean lesser luxury lifestyle, but certain kind of pillars of what they see as intelligentsia lifestyle in certain elements of their lives.
Would you relate that to what Rachel Sherman finds for the New York or US super wealthy that also claim to be upper middle class and very modest and only need to invest in, important education and houses, but not be too ostentatious?
I think Sherman's interviewees in New York are nevertheless a few light years. I don't know whether you can see ahead, but still,
they're more used to their wealth already.
They're more used to their wealth, and they're also, what I remember from her research, also the focus she makes on how keen they are to bring their children up as good people who have a certain awareness that some people live differently like they do and things like that. So I wouldn't say that this aspect is anything that is yet very important among the Russian upper class. They're too new to
luxury,
have this generosity in how they relate to people outside their social class.
Yeah, that brings me to the question of how they relate to the rest of the country, right? Because I mean, it's a fairly small group of people, and I'm sure they are all friends amongst themselves and have a great time together. But I mean, the rest of the country, Russia, is not particularly rich, and especially the first years and decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union was really tough for a very large part of the population. Do they have any conception of how the rest of the country lives, or do they have relationships with them, or?
There are two things. So in their schooling, in the 90s, especially in the 2000s, you had all kind of private schools mushrooming in all the luxury suburbs. But many, especially kind of more sophisticated parents, very quickly realized that if they expose their children to this very insular environments, it will actually hold them back in many ways. So they realized very quickly that if you want your child to develop, you better have it mingle with this kind of very urban, much poorer, typical middle class, intelligentsia children from more modest families. And they sent them to state schools, very, very selected. There's kind of a big hierarchy in the state, sort of to the very best state schools in Moscow usually. That doesn't mean that people mingle with simple people from other strata in society. So it is, if they do, then it's people from the cultural world, from the world of arts, people of that sort, but not the simple population. In the province where they are, if you ask how they relate to them, they've developed already a certain kind of very strong paternalism. Many of philanthropists, many of the rich have set up their own personal foundations, and many of them are set in some Russian region. And in many cases, also mono industry. So many towns are dependent on, they used to be dependent in Soviet times on one big factory that produced, let's say, something for the arms industry or something of that sort. And especially there are natural resources, there's now this big mono industry where an oligarch has, let's say, their gas or oil destruction, and it's kind of the main deployer, the whole town depending on it. And there many philanthropists set up their foundations, which there's, for example, there was this one wife of a billionaire, Irina Sedik, and her husband, and she runs her husband's charity. And she said it's a big, after the 2014 crisis, the oil price went down and the ruble was devaluated quite sharply. And in that situation, they had to lay off people in this region. And then it was their own foundation who would then kind of soothe the landing of look after the people their own company had laid off. And there is one that kind of clear. She was very aware that, of course, once you sack a person, you bring suffering to not only the person, but the whole family that is dependent on this person. And in that setting, it seemed almost that she's tried and also to revive the cultural life of the town, bring teens off the street and not fall for drugs, and all kind of cultural projects she organized. And there's a kind of a feature, I've seen it in her, many others, especially in such a setting. She's almost assumed a certain role of moral leadership. So now she sees her role as not only looking after the people her husband laid off, but also to instill into the people a certain sense of civic understanding of civil society by involving them into her own fundraising. So in her case, it's that she attracts a lot of volunteers who look after ill children and all kind of things. In other cases, like Arwen and his foundation, Linie Жизни, there it's even a little bit further. They run a charity that carries out surgeries for very ill children. And the charity exclusively pays for the administrative staff and all the logistics, but not for any surgeries themselves. So the surgeries are paid for by normal, ordinary people who are engaged in the fundraising. So they collect money from ordinary Russians, and also have ordinary Russians doing the fundraising for them. And they are very clear about it. Again, they kind of see their role as this kind of a certain moral leadership in training from a very early stage normal people into being part of civil society and making them part of the whole process. And that is already then again related to Arwen's basic idea that eventually in an ideal neoliberal society, social infrastructure should be run in this certain way.
I mean, there's so many interesting aspects there. I don't even know where I would want to start. But I wanted to ask you before we close, what do you think would be important things that we could research further on that we don't know yet? What would be interesting for you to look into now that you already know a lot about this constellation?
Well, now I'm very curious about the process of how they will be passing on their fortunes to their children. So there's this process of inheritance, which will be laid loose soon and has to be passed on in one way or the other. And I think we're quite privileged at the moment, because we could be doing it real time and seeing the next 5 to 10 years of what their plans are, what they are doing in practice, what will come out of it. So everything step by step, what kind of ideas they have around their visions, the whole ideology that surrounds their ideas. And then, of course, also questions of legitimacy also among the young generation. I had only one, that's not a kind of a normal phenomenon, but there was one son of a rich Russian who said that it's actually pretty out of order that he can afford himself such a lifestyle just for the very fact that he's the son of his father, without actually deserving it in any way. So how will it work that the young generation will be able to develop a certain sense of deservedness and status and righteousness for themselves? The other features, I mean, this young guy was a big exception. As one case, I could see it a little. There was a young woman who had this idea of, she was just installed into one company in a leading position where her father is a big shareholder. She had the idea that she deserved this position because she was born and grew up in a certain setting where they always had such a spirit of discussion, where she learned so much. And that gave her so many skills that she also deserves to be in this leading position at her young age, because she just developed so much faster than others, thanks to the setting in which she grew up in. So there are kind of ways for people, as we can see, to find their rationale, but I guess there will be very different stories and would be fascinating to observe them. Another thing I'd like to do is look at, starting with British society, but I think it would be interesting to be looked at any place in the world, of how money turns into power. So how, if you stick to the Russians, how supervisory Russians coming to London manages to, or tries to, become part of the British establishment. And we have cases where it's worked out. For example, Len Blavatnik, knighted by the Queen a few years ago, is very much part of the establishment, and he's managed becoming part of it by doing a lot of philanthropy. So we've got the Tate Modern and one of the towers.
Oxford School.
The Blavatnik School of Government. Then the new tower of the Tate Modern, which is called Blavatnik Tower. But also by a lot of effort he put into what I would call reputation laundering. So every journalist would be sued right away if they called him a Russian oligarch. He wanted to be called an American philanthropist of Jewish Ukrainian descent. And it's gone so far that I've been in situation, especially those where in an academic setting where you discuss philanthropic matters with both practitioners and academics. And if I just mention something of the sort, that Blavatnik made his money like most of the oligarchs in the 1990s, based on oil, being part of the whole machinery, I've been attacked quite badly by some people who have such a belief in him and admire him so much that they found it unbearable that there was someone like me equaling him with all those 1990 oligarchs. So he's managed it so well that he's got almost his kind of defenders or apostates in kind of the population who would stand up for him if he's presented a different way than he wants to be presented. So in a project of that sort, I'd be very interested in to see what it exactly is. So we've got a certain idea that once you have tons of money, of course you've got political influence, but I'd be interested to see in what it exactly takes from a sociological perspective of the different pillars, different strategies people pursue in order to make their money really work in form of political influence, and also to gain this social acceptability within the ruling class or establishment of a certain setting. So that's my other interest.
Sounds absolutely fantastic, and I really hope that you will do the research and then maybe write The New Rich Russians, or any follow-up, because highly recommendable book, The First Rich Russians. Do check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Elisabeth, we're coming to a close. Would you like to tell us one more thing that we haven't talked about that you think is really important for all of us to know?
But one thing is also, whenever I contemplate about follow-up research, people often want me to do research comparing rich Russians to maybe rich people in the Middle East or Chinese or Indians and so on. And I sometimes feel there's a certain kind of Western-centric arrogance in it. In a lot of the things I've discovered, I often feel it's almost the Russians are kind of quite a brutal, a very clear, very brutal mirror of what in a much more subtle, much milder form is nevertheless going on among Western elites. So I think comparison, I don't want to say that it wouldn't be super interesting to do a comparison with Chinese elites, but nevertheless, I think it is just as important to keep in mind the comparison to elites in the most developed countries. And that is something many people don't want to hear. Sometimes feel, even in academia, there's a certain thinking of almost a patriotic alignment with one's own elites, a certain kind of feeling of superiority towards those rogue Russians or something of that sort, which I hope I can overcome.
I really hope you will. Sounds a little bit like a football match, my elite against your elite or something like that. But I mean, elites have something in common also across countries, and they have some particularities in each local setting, right? And we know that from our comparative conversations about elites in all kind of different countries and all over the world. Elisabeth, I want to thank you very much for these insights on the rich Russians and on elite formation in a context of fast social change in general, which was the case in Russia over the last 30 years. Thank you very much for being here with us, Elisabeth Schimpfössl from Aston University. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, then join us again next time at Futures Frame TV. I'm Alice Crozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.